Hello, my name is April Kendra, and this is The Haunting of Charles Dickens, Amelia B. Edwards, and Mr. H. In the autumn of 1861, Charles Dickens was haunted by several specters that continue to hover around him. The 14 September 1861 issue of All the Year Round included a piece simply titled Four Stories, which the narrator presents as a group of ghost stories collected from credible sources. 3 weeks later, Dickens published an expanded version of the first of the four stories, which featured Mr. H, an artist. The second version, Mr. H's own narrative, included a short preface explaining that Mr. H, a real existing person and a responsible gentleman, had recognized his own incorrectly told story and had offered the authoritative version. Many readers have assumed that this Mr. H was a fictional character, but Thomas Heaphy was in fact a real existing person. As Dickens explained to John Forster, upon the publication of the ghost story, up has started the portrait painter who saw the phantoms. His own written story is out of all distance the most extraordinary that ever was produced. Everything connected with it is amazing, but conceive this. The portrait painter has been engaged to write it elsewhere as a story for next Christmas, and not unnaturally supposed, when he saw himself anticipated in All the Year Round, that there had been treachery at his printers. The controversy was highlighted in A Hankering After Ghosts, Charles Dickens and the Supernatural, an exhibition sponsored by the British Library to celebrate the bicentennial anniversary of Dickens' birth. Journalists and bloggers breathlessly reported on Dickens' plagiarism of Heaphy without recognizing an important twist. Dickens hadn't written four stories either. On August 31st of 1861, Dickens wrote to W.H. Wills, "In last Wednesday's makeup is a paper which I have called Four Stories by Gleig's Fair Friend. They're ghost stories. The first, by far the best, is a remarkably good and original one. I nearly rewrote them all." The Reverend G.R. Gleig acted as an intermediary between Dickens and Amelia B. Edwards, Victorian author, antiquarian, and ghost. Amelia Edwards was notable for her many talents and interests in music, art, and Egyptology. Although she's best remembered for her establishment of the Egyptian Exploration Society, in 1861 she was building a reputation as an author of ghost stories. Just as the recent discussions about Thomas Heaphy include no mention of Amelia Edwards, the two collections of Edwards' ghost stories utterly ignore Heaphy. The collected supernatural and weird fiction of Amelia B. Edwards includes both four stories and Mr. H's own narrative, which the editors title The Portrait Painter's Story and a tribute to Dickens. The Phantom Coach Collected Ghost Stories, edited by Richard Dalby, notes that Edwards collected rather than invented the four stories and includes the preface that appeared in All the Year Round. All four shall be told exactly as I, the present narrator, have received them. They are all derived from credible sources, and the first, the most extraordinary of the four, is well known at first hand to individuals living. That first story begins on September 13th, when Mr. H travels to the country to paint a portrait of Lord F. He shares a railway carriage with a lovely young woman who seems to know his work and asks if he could paint her from memory. When he hesitates, she instructs him, "Look at me again. You may have to take a likeness of me." The train stops and the lady exits after informing her bewildered companion, "We shall meet again soon." That evening, H is charmed to discover her at Lord F's home, where he assumes she's a close family friend. She sits next to him at dinner and eagerly looks at the pictures Mr. H displays. However, when he inquires after her the next day, a servant insists, "No lady dined here last night," and Lord F confirms, "There was no one at table but yourself, my lady, and I." Over the next 2 years, Mr. H thinks often of the mysterious encounter, but never speaks of it until a business trip to Canterbury. He writes to ask an old friend, Mr. Wilde, to help him to meet him at the hotel, but he's startled by the appearance of a stranger who bears the same name. This Mr. Wilde is mourning the loss of his daughter and asks H if he could make a portrait based on a description, but the experiment fails. On a whim, H draws a sketch of the mysterious young lady, and Mr. Wilde delightedly confirms that this is his daughter's exact likeness. Mr. H learns that Miss Wilde died on September 13th, the same day that he met the lady on the train. Thomas Heaphy lost no time in writing to Dickens and identifying himself as the real Mr. H. Dickens apologized for having innocently forestalled Heaphy's plans for his ghost story and offered to publish it at the earliest opportunity. The new version appeared in the October 5th edition with an introduction from the editor. There was lately published in these pages a paper entitled 4 Stories. The first of those stories related the strange experience of a well-known English artist, Mr. H. On the publication of that account, Mr. H himself addressed the conductor of this journal, to his great surprise, and forwarded to him his own narrative of the occurrences in question. And great injustice having been unconsciously done to it, it follows here exactly as received. It is, of course, published with the sanction and authority of Mr. H, and Mr. H has himself corrected the proofs. It only remains to add that no one has for a moment stood between us and Mr. H in this matter. Least of all, Amelia Edwards, it seems. Heaphy's Mr. H narrates a string of accidents, missed connections, and chance meetings that begin in May 1858 and lead to 3 ghostly encounters the following autumn. As in Edward's story, Mr. H meets the mysterious lady on a train. The day having arrived for my visit, I took my place in the morning train from York to London. The train would stop at Doncaster and after that at Retford Junction, where I should have to get out in order to take the line through Lincoln to A. The day was cold, wet, foggy, and in every way as disagreeable as I have ever known a day to be in an English October. The carriage in which I was seated had no other occupant than myself, but at Doncaster a lady got in. Mr. H notes that the young lady spoke to him as if they were already acquainted and consulted him about her route. When the narrator leaves her, the lady says, "I dare say we shall meet again," but he is still greatly surprised to meet her again that evening. My bewilderment at the moment almost deprived me of utterance. I knew of no railway or other means by which she could have come. I'd certainly left her in her London train and had seen it start, and the only conceivable way in which she could have come was by going on to Peterborough and then returning by a branch to A circuit of about 90 miles. As soon as my surprise enabled me to speak, I said that I wished I had come by the same conveyance as herself. "That would have been rather difficult," she rejoined. The young lady asks H if he could paint her portrait from memory and suggests that he might use a popular print of Lady M.A.'s portrait as a model, as many think it is like her. Later, Mr. H realizes they were never introduced, nor did she speak to anyone else. Heaphy's account now departs from Edwards by including a third encounter. On a December afternoon, just before Christmas, the mysterious lady suddenly appears in Mr. H's studio to repeat her request for a portrait. She offers him a copy of the print they had discussed and allows H to make 2 quick sketches of her before making a dramatic farewell. I accompanied her to the door, outside of which she seemed rather to fade into the darkness than to pass through it. Several weeks later, H invites an old acquaintance, Mr. Klein, to meet him at the hotel where he's staying. When Mr. Lute, a complete stranger, arrives, H realizes that he accidentally wrote the wrong name on the message. However, Mr. Lute takes this opportunity to commission a portrait of his daughter Caroline. Maria Lute, Caroline's sister, tells H that her father is insane with grief and obsessed with obtaining a portrait, but H cannot make a satisfactory sketch based on Maria's descriptions alone. Maria regrets that she has misplaced a print, the portrait of Lady M.A., that might have been helpful. Struck by the coincidence, H shows Maria the sketches he made of his visitor and the picture she gave him. Mr. Lute confirms that the sketches look exactly like Caroline, and Maria insists that the picture has been taken from her album. What's more, Mr. Lute reveals that his delusions were actually visions of his daughter in a railway carriage, at a dinner table, in an assembly, and standing next to the artist as he drew. Mr. Lute returns to full health and the story closes. The portrait now hangs in his bedroom, and written beneath is C.L., 13th September, 1858, age 22. Mr. H's own narrative includes greater character development and a more dramatic conclusion than Edwards' abbreviated version, but it also strains the reader's patience with unnecessary details and implausible coincidences. It also presents a curiously corporeal ghost who eats, drinks, fusses with her clothing, and shakes hands with the narrator. The postscript to his September 17th letter shows that Dickens found these details troubling. I observed in your narrative that you mentioned the young ladies eating the beef and drinking the claret. Do you remember whether the joint was placed on the table or carved on the sideboard? And whether you seemed to see the figures served as the three mortals were served, or seemed to find it already carved without noticing the progress? These questions are not resolved in the final printing. Dickens' correspondence between September 15th and September 20th shows that Heaphy was convinced that someone at his printer's office had betrayed him. Dickens strove to persuade him that the story had been in general circulation for some time and called on Edward Bulwer-Lytton for assistance. My dear Bulwer-Lytton, I wish you would look at the last published number of All the Year Round and read the first story in a paper there called Four Stories. For this reason, Layard is staying here and remembers you're telling a version of the same story at Knebworth. I want to know what that version was and whence it came. And I want that for this reason. On the publication of that number of All the Year Round, up starts the artist himself and sends me in black and white his own account of the whole experience, which is so very original, so very extraordinary, and so very far beyond the version I published that I am burning with the desire to relate it to you. All other like stories turn pale before it. After 5 days of feverish letter writing, Dickens reported to Heaphy, Mr. Layard has not been able to remember where or when he saw some version of your story in print. Sir Edward Lytton received his version in writing from Mr. Edward Ward. Sir Edward informs me that his version is very superior to that published here. I therefore suppose it is told nearer your own. In all of his letters on the subject, Dickens stresses that Heapy's is the authentic and correct account and insists that it is far beyond Edward's, which he regards as incorrect, wrong, and imperfectly told. Nevertheless, Dickens invited Edwards to contribute to the next Christmas issue, an honor he did not extend to Heapy. Despite all of Dickens' efforts, Heaphy remained suspicious of his printers because Four Stories had correctly identified September 13th as the date of the heroine's death, a detail Heaphy had included in his manuscript, but never shared in relating the story to friends. Dickens explained that the version he received had no date at all. When I came to revise the story in the proof for press, the need of some precise date was so clear to me that I myself inserted on the margin of the proof the date you find in the published narrative. There seems little reason to doubt Dickens' explanation, especially as the British Library exhibition included a proof of four stories with September 13th penciled in the margin. However, there's a real possibility that Heaphy lied. He could have changed the date in his own story after reading Edwards. In his account, Mr. H doesn't meet the lady until October, so the precise date of September 13th means very little. Given the flaws and inconsistencies of Heapy's story, why did Dickens praise it so extravagantly to Forster, Bulwer-Lytton, and Layard? Perhaps he found parallels between Mr. H's flirtation with a ghost and his own relationship with an invisible woman, Ellen Ternan. First, the story is set in 1858, and the narrator meets the mysterious lady at Doncaster, which would trigger important memories for Dickens. After meeting Ellen Ternan during the rehearsals for The Frozen Deep, Dickens persuaded Wilkie Collins to go with him to Doncaster, where the Ternan sisters were performing at the Royal Theatre. Dickens would forever after associate Doncaster with his tormenting passion. On 21 March 1858, he wrote to Collins, "The Doncaster unhappiness remains so strong upon me that I can't write, and waking can't rest 1 minute. I have never known a moment's peace or content since the last night of the Frozen Deep. I do suppose that there was never a man so seized and rended by one spirit." Second, a great deal of the plot traces the narrator's travel by train. The first clue to the lady's ghostly identity is that she arrives at H's destination before he does, although she's traveling in the wrong direction. Dickens was at this time making skillful use of train schedules to hide his visits to Ellen. Finally, Dickens might have shared in the vindication of Mr. Lute and his visions. When those about me considered that my intellect was disordered and that I spoke incoherently, it was only because I saw things that they did not. Publishing Heapy's story allowed Dickens both to celebrate and to disguise his relationship with Nellie Ternan, hiding her in plain sight. The Mr. H controversy emphasizes the ways in which Dickens also ghosted Amelia B. Edwards. He never identifies her or her proxy, Reverend Gleig, in his correspondence with Heapy. He says only that he received the four ghost stories from a gentleman of a distinguished position who sent it on behalf of a young writer in whom he feels an interest. Of course, Dickens would shield a young contributor from potentially damaging allegations, but in his eagerness to track down the earlier versions of the story, why wouldn't he ask Edwards about her source? There's no evidence that he consulted her or Gleig, although he assures them that Heaphy is satisfied and, quote, there is no harm whatever done, unquote. Not only did Dickens rely on intermediaries to communicate with Edwards, but he was surprisingly reluctant to use her name. In his letters to Gleig, Dickens calls Edwards a new aspirant, our protege, and the authoress of 4 stories. His intention may have been to protect Edwards' reputation as well as his own, but the result has been Edwards' disappearance. Heaphy and Edwards are still struggling for recognition, or at least for distinction from one another and from Dickens. The online edition of All the Year-Round Dickens Journals Online attributes 4 stories to Thomas Heaphy and a friend of George Robert Gleig. In October 2020, Canterbury Cathedral published a video of the dean reading Heapy's tale, which is described as a classic ghost story by Dickens. And perhaps the strangest conflation is in a 2011 article in The Guardian that identifies Dickens as the author of Edward's story and summarizes it with a quotation from Heapy's narrative. It seems we can accommodate only one ghost at a time. Thus, Thomas Heaphy, who arose like a vengeful spirit in a Gothic novel, eager to claim the property usurped by another, attracts attention with his clamor, while Amelia Edwards, whose name was deliberately suppressed by a protective and secretive editor, continues to haunt the margins of her own story. Like the mysterious lady on the train, Edwards challenges us to capture her likeness based on fleeting acquaintance with the shadow. But as long-hidden clues come to light, we hear her whisper, "We shall meet again soon."